Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. To celebrate the return of face-to-face Magic tournaments in my country, I wanted to take an episode and talk a little bit about a mechanic that you might not have seen if you don't play digitally. I'm talking, of course, about modal double-faced cards. Even though these have been part of the last several sets, they haven't been part of any Magic tournaments that have taken place face-to-face. So, if you're looking for a short primer on how these cards work before your next F&M, well, you're in the right place. Okay, so like the name suggests, modal double-faced cards are double-faced, they have a magic card on both faces, and they're modal, which means that you can pick which face you want to play, unlike traditional transforming double-faced cards, which have a designated front face, and that's the only one that you're able to play. Of course, you still have to be legally allowed to cast the spell that you're trying to cast. So, for example, if you controlled Steel Golem, you would not be able to cast Blex Vexing Pest, although you would be able to cast its back half, Search for Blex, just fine. That's because at no point does the game see that you're trying to cast a creature spell when you're trying to cast Search for Blex. It only sees you playing a sorcery, and so there's no problem at all. Another difference between transforming double-faced cards that you may be used to and the new modal double-faced cards is that the modal double-faced cards aren't transforming. In other words, they cannot transform. If an effect tries to transform them, or put them onto the battlefield transformed, then that effect does nothing, because those instructions are impossible to carry out. A modal double-faced card just doesn't work like that. Instead, the card would stay in its current zone, or the card would stay on the battlefield with whatever face was up, staying face up. One way that modal double-faced cards are like their transforming counterparts is what would happen if you put one on the battlefield and you're not playing it. So, for example, if we were to use Flicker Wisp against a Lucca, what would happen when you tried to return it to the battlefield during the end step? So, with double-faced cards, be they modal or otherwise, if an effect is trying to put it onto the battlefield, it enters by default with its front face up. Now, in this case, that would mean that you would return it to the battlefield as Mila, Crafty Companion, even though that's not the face of the card that was exiled. The game puts it back onto the battlefield with its front face up, always. Okay, so that's cool, but you might be wondering what would happen if we were going to play that Flicker Wisp against a card like, say, Balaged Sanctuary. As you might have noticed, the front face of that card is a sorcery, not a land. So what would happen is you would exile the Balaged Sanctuary, and then, during the end step when you tried to return it to the battlefield, the game would notice that there's a problem. Remember, we always return it to the battlefield with its front face up. However, in this case, the front face is a sorcery, and you cannot put sorceries onto the battlefield. Accordingly, the instruction to return it to the battlefield is not possible to perform. So, this card will stay in the exile zone indefinitely. Another thing that's important to know about double-faced cards, modal or otherwise, is that they generally only have one set of characteristics. So, if you have it on the battlefield, or you're casting it as a spell, you would look at whatever face is face up. And the characteristics on the other face, well, as far as the game is concerned, those just don't exist. When they're not on the battlefield or being cast as a spell, the rule is even easier. You look at whatever the front face is, and the characteristics of the back half just don't exist. This is true for modal double-faced cards and transforming double-faced cards, but there's one slight difference in how this rule is applied. See, most transforming double-faced cards, because you can't cast the back half, don't have a mana cost on the back half. And so, if you wanted to look at the mana value of those cards, you would be able to cheat and peek at the front face in order to look at the mana cost that that face has. And then you would determine the mana value based on the mana cost on the front face. Because modal double-faced cards have a mana cost on both the front half and the back half, since you're intended to be able to cast either one, then this rule does not apply, and you make it even easier on yourself by just looking at whatever face is face up and taking the mana value based on that mana cost. So, one more example question. Let's say we wanted to search for Blex using a Mystical Tutor. Could we do that? The answer is unfortunately no, we couldn't. The reasoning is because when it's in the library, only the characteristics of Blex Vexing Pest will exist. The characteristics of the back half do not exist. And so, accordingly, you will not be able to find it with Mystical Tutor. You would need something like, say, a Worldly Tutor or a Time of Heroes to be able to find this card. One more thing that I wanted to touch on, and this was a very popular request, was the interaction between Modal double-faced cards and Crucible of Worlds. This was a really spicy one, so you're not going to want to miss this. Let's say that in our graveyard we had a Kazandu Mammoth, and we wanted to play its back half, Kazandu Valley. Would we be able to do that? So the first thing we're going to need in order to answer this question is going to be the current Oracle text of Crucible of Worlds. You might notice that there's a slight change. Even though there is no current printing that has this text on it, this is the Oracle text, and it's very important to notice the subtle distinction between this text and its printed text. So, if you look at it, you'll notice that the old version said that you could play land cards from your graveyard, whereas the new one just says that you can play lands. What's the difference? Well, think about the old one saying, okay, all these cards in your graveyard, any of them that are land cards, will give you a special permission to be able to cast. So, all the cards in your graveyard that are lands get a special extra permission put on them. Now, that's not very good for our friend the Mammoth here, because remember, in the graveyard, only the characteristics on the front face exist. In other words, it's not considered to be a land card, and therefore you wouldn't be able to play it. However, if you look at the new wording, you'll see it says you can play lands. Now, what does the process of playing a land look like? Unlike spells, which have a specific set of procedures that you need to carry out step by step in order to cast them, when you're playing a land, you basically just take it from wherever it is and put it on the battlefield, and that's what you do to play a land. When you have a modal double-faced card where one of the faces is a land, there's a little bit of an extra step though. You have to look at the card and then choose one of the faces that you're playing as a land. Now, that step happens immediately before it enters the battlefield, and this is why the new wording is so important. When it says you can play lands from your graveyard, what that means is that every time you do a land play, the game looks and sees if you played the land from your graveyard or your hand, and if you played it from either of those zones, then you're A-OK. Now, if you were to look at the process of playing a land with Crucible of Worlds out, well, Crucible of Worlds changes only one thing about the process of playing a land, that is, what zone you can play it from. So, everything else about the process of playing land stays exactly the same. In this case, what that means is that you would be able to take the card from your graveyard and put it onto the battlefield. And the game would see, well, we played a land, yep, and it came from our graveyard, but Crucible of Worlds says that's okay, so we're good with this play. Therefore, you can indeed play this card as a land from your graveyard when you have Crucible of Worlds out. Pretty awesome stuff, right? So, that's all I had prepared for today. How did you do? Join me again tomorrow for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.